You have no idea how tired I get of hearing that particular introduction, but thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, boss, for providing it for me.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. When I was asked, when I arrived in immigration, the immigration lady was quite nice. She said, have you been in Israel before? And I said, yes, I was here 16 years ago. She said, oh, much has changed. And in a cab coming to the hotel, the cab driver asked, have you been to Israel before? And I said, yes, 16 years ago. And he said, much has changed. And at the bar, the bartender said, have you been to Israel before? And I said, yes, 16 years ago. And the bartender said, well, much has changed. Much has changed, including my math. I was actually here 26 years ago. And this morning I was doing the math. I mean, I did go to Harvard, but I wasn't a math major, okay? I was doing the numbers in my head. And it was 26 years ago I was here, and yes, much has changed, so it's good to be back. Before I begin my comments, Dean Ganor and Mr. Davis, I would like to thank you very much for the tribute to Nick Pratt yesterday. It was a first-class tribute to a first-class guy. I was moved. I know he would be moved too, so thank you very much. So, by way of introduction, I'd like to preface my remarks with two disclaimers. First, I am on record as being a critic, very critical, of the Obama administration's counterterrorism policy. In fact, in a Washington Times editorial published the day before our presidential election, I took the president to task for his commentary during the run-up to the election. And he said frequently that Al-Qaeda was on the run, Al-Qaeda core was decimated, and in my article, my op-ed, I said, indeed, Al-Qaeda's on the run, they're running amok. And I listed several reasons that actually have come to fore. Interestingly, and maybe not surprisingly, 45 days after I wrote that particular op-ed piece, for the first time in my 68 years, the IRS audited me. No cause and effect, I'm sure. Second, my second point, and more relevant to today's talk, I've also been a critic for the last 4 or 5 years of the United States long-term counterterrorism policy, particularly the Al-Qaeda variety. For years I have said the policy, which has essentially been to deny Al-Qaeda sanctuary so that they can attack the United States again like they did in the 9/11. I mean, our policy was to sort of do keep them on the run. As a result, in my view, the United States and allies have chased a decentralized AQ around the globe for more than a decade at great expense and with considerable loss of blood and national treasure. Supposedly allowing Al-Qaeda sanctuary would have enabled them to launch another 9/11, and the policy has been to keep them from being able to do that. I think this is incorrect policy. And I'll try and make the case today that allowing Al-Qaeda or perhaps IS sanctuary may not be such a bad idea. Why do I say that? When Al-Qaeda had sanctuary in Sudan, the United States and Western allies were able to leverage diplomacy to have the Sudanese kick bin Laden and Al-Qaeda out of Sudan. In Afghanistan, when Al-Qaeda had sanctuary, was organized horizontally, had committees, de facto state, special operations forces, air power, and indigenous Afghans defeated Al-Qaeda rather convincingly and rather quickly. So this notion that Al-Qaeda, we can't let them have sanctuary. I mean, what if we'd let them have sanctuary, enable them to have sanctuary in, say, Yemen or Somalia? We'll never know. But I think that the elements of power that a state like the United States and allies has is better at addressing a de facto state than an amorphous, cellular, network-structured organization that is difficult to find. So, is that a way of preface to my comments on IS today? My view is jihadists, extremists, terrorists, whatever brand you give them, gaining sanctuary, I don't see it as a challenge but as an opportunity. And this logic extends to the most serious jihadist group the U.S. has had to deal with to date, and I think that, as some of our previous presenters have said, as IS. Many pundits, including very good friends of mine, disagree with me and are predicting dire results if IS campaign in Iraq, Syria, and the greater Levant continues unabated. One of these is my longtime friend and co-author Bruce Hoffman, who recently was quoted in the Wall Street Journal as saying that IS has the kinetic power, the recruiting power, and the finances that, left unchecked, will be very difficult to deal with. Retired Colonel Steve Bucci, another very good friend and former subordinate, along with 4 others at the Heritage Foundation, actually wrote an interesting article comparing IS to Al-Qaeda, 11 points, and all of the points sort of predicting that IS will be a more serious foe than Al-Qaeda. I've broken these down into sort of 6, and I'm going to use them to sort of challenge them in a couple minutes in my presentation. But their logic is that IS is more serious than Al-Qaeda for the following reasons. It's the richest terrorist group in history. It has looted at least 5 banks in Iraq, including Mosul Central Bank, which yielded more than $400 million in gold and Iraqi currency, controls income-generating oil fields in Syria and Iraq, has pocketed millions of dollars collecting by demanding ransoms for people held hostage. The group has generated income through extortion, by selling electricity, exporting oil and gas, all of which have left them flush with cash. Is that pretty much what, yeah?
No IRS audit on those guys.
Not yet. Yeah. Number 2, according to the Heritage Foundation, IS currently controls a territory the size of Maryland. And I'm not a geographer, but I think they actually seek territory about the size of Colorado, but I'll let the geographers determine that. IS has evolved into a proto-state with its own army, civil administration, judiciary, and even a sophisticated propaganda operation. IS is more brutal than Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups, which in a macabre way makes them better at recruiting, or so some believe. IS has captured huge amounts of weaponry and equipment in Iraq and Syria, making it the most heavily armed Islamist extremist group in history. Number 6, the leader of IS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is more charismatic than Al-Qaeda's al-Zawahiri, which helps the group's recruiting efforts. Okay, so those, I guess, are challenges. Let me say that I think they might be opportunities and explain my rationale. I'll do this one by one, not necessarily in order. Yes, they control territory. IS controls territory. And they seek to control more territory in Iraq, Syria, and maybe even a small section of Lebanon or other sections of the Levant. This territory will have to be governed by some type of bureaucratic structure. It will need a capital, both of which, instantly, are good targets. This territory will have a currency or will use out of another state. It will need a banking center, much as one of our presentators said, where it conducts transactions. Again, good targets, if not military targets, at least financial targets. Who in here has read the Starfish and the Spider? Raise your hand. If you have not read the Starfish, it's only a book. It's 2 MBAs at Stanford wrote it. It talks about networks. Networks. It takes a network to defeat a network. They mention Al-Qaeda twice on one page in the book. It's not about Al-Qaeda. But in it, it explains how you defeat networks. And one of the ways is to be a network. The other way is to make that network look like you. And they use an example of the Apache in the United States. The United States did not defeat the Apaches. when they were a networked, cellular structured organization. What we did is we gave them cattle. Cattle. Cattle have to be managed, cattle have to be moved, cattle have to be given water, cattle have to be moved to pasture. It's when the Apaches took the cattle and they had to act like a bureaucratic organization, we knew where they were going to be and when they were going to be there. That's how we defeated it. So in my view, a network cellular organization, if you can't be networked like them, maybe make them look like you. And I think giving terrorist organizations sanctuary sort of does that. Let me continue. The argument is that an Islamic State would be well-funded, this IS would be well-funded by oil revenue. I'm not so sure. IS presently has to sell the oil it controls from its territory to Turkish and Syrian brokers at discounted rates, highly discounted rates. These brokers and their operations are vulnerable to security forces, they're vulnerable to economic forces. Again, they're good targets. Running active oil fields requires management, maintenance, and transportation acumen. Refining oil is even more complicated. That raises the question of how much longer IS can manage oil fields and a fledgling refining industry without help. And where does that help come from? It doesn't come from jihadist groups. It comes from contractors, mostly Western contractors. The so-called caliphate will need a transportation system to move not only its oil, but other goods and services, which will likely include air, rail, and road networks, all of which translate, at least in my lexicon, to good targets. We know that IS gets much of its funding from extorting money from its de facto state's residents. But this is a short-term benefit. Read Brian Jenkins' recent article when he discusses the sort of income earning potential. Short-term, yes. Long-term, it's very hard to extort money from people who don't have money. All right? So yes, I think in the short term they have financial gain. Long term, I'm not so sure. As for gaining possession of advanced U.S. military equipment, or Russian equipment, the U.S. equipment they got in Iraq, Russian equipment in Syria, the U.S. equipment captured from Iraqis has been maintained by U.S. contractors. They didn't go over to the other side, okay? So how much longer they can parade up and down in howitzers, and I think is not much longer. And even Russian equipment, which doesn't need as much maintenance, is going to break down. Also, armored vehicles of any variety, Russian or U.S., make very good targets. Not just, self-propelled howitzers, armored personnel carriers, Humvees, they make good targets. All of these things I've mentioned imply centralization and bureaucracy protected by a conventional security apparatus that will make the IS caliphate, in my view, vulnerable to the Western way of war. We know how to attack and defeat static structures, systems based on bureaucracy and administrative control, financial markets, communications, and transportation systems. When IS was decentralized and flexible, it was difficult to attack. But now that the group is more centralized and centralizing more every day, I think it will be easier. IS is extremely brutal. One need only turn on the evening news to hear the beheadings, see the beheadings that are becoming all too frequent evidence of their brutality. IS is the most violent terrorist organization the U.S. has encountered, perhaps the most brutal ever. However, the fear of this kind of brutality may only result in short-term control for a couple of reasons. First, I don't know what the sociological term is for this, but there is a point in any society where violence, a society will not tolerate any more violence. In the United States, it was in the 30s. We had this gangland environment. Finally, citizenry in the United States got tired of it, and it stopped. I think the violence again, those residents of the so-called violence, eventually the violence will become so severe that they will rebel. Second, and for every person IS murders, there is someone, or more than someone, who will remember and most likely want revenge. I also believe that extremely brutal Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi will eventually become a target, just like his predecessor, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and meet the same fate. Number 5, IS is good at recruiting. Am I running over time there, John? Am I doing okay?
I'm not messing around with special forces.
Okay. I'm almost done. Good at recruiting. This is true. And it's all over the news now. They're very good at recruiting. But it's interesting to look at who's being recruited. Reports indicate that more than half the 20,000 foot soldiers in IS are foreign fighters. 3,000 of them come from the West, including 100 to 150 from the United States. The prevalence of foreign fighters in the ranks of IS and their predecessor, AQI, was a major reason for AQI's undoing. And my guess is it will also be a major factor in the undoing of IS. No population likes an occupier, just ask the United States. And as foreign fighters continue to proliferate in IS, they will be seen as occupiers by the citizens of the so-called caliphate. So again, I see the foreign fighters of recruiting maybe perhaps an opportunity, not a challenge. It's number 6. There are some other considerations that we need to think about. It would be naive to think that IS will not face serious competition once the caliphate or the state solidifies. Other Sunni groups such as al-Qaeda and its ally, the al-Nusra Front, as well as opposition Free Syrian Army, will compete with IS for control of the Syrian portion of the caliphate, as will Shia entities such as Hezbollah and Iran, both of which identify with Assad and Alawites. The enemy of my enemy is my friend proverb is alive and well in this territory called IS. I'd like to add 2 final critiques of my own, critiques against me. There clearly is a risk in what I advocate. That is, to allow IS to gain sanctuary in a centralized geographic space. Make no mistake, IS will hit the West, or try to hit the West, including the United States, when able. Thus, the challenge in what I propose is to take advantage of the target IS presents as a geographically organized bureaucratic entity trying to protect its sovereignty, oil, and production facilities before they are organized well enough to carry out such an attack. I understand the margin of error is slight. However, solid intelligence and cooperative intelligence will be key in avoiding this risk in what I advocate. Finally, I want to address the argument some are making in the United States and others in the West that the U.S. and the West not get involved and let the competing forces in Iraq and Syria just fight it out. This view is particularly prevalent in the libertarian movement in the United States, and at first blush, it had some appeal to me. However, the violence the IS leadership has directed against nonviolent groups such as Christians and Yazidis, to say nothing of women and children of all opposing groups, demands that something be done. Given the brutality of IS, the U.S., its Western allies, and other Middle Eastern states have an obligation to protect the minority groups that are being victimized. In closing, just one comment. I was asked this on CNN last week about our Secretary of State's notion of a coalition. First of all, I was amazed that CNN called me because I did Fox for a year and I didn't think it would translate to CNN, but that's another story. But they asked me about the coalition and if I agreed with the Secretary of State about a coalition, and I do. A coalition is important, and yesterday you heard several of the speakers mention coalition. So they asked me, well, what should the coalition look like? And I think it's pretty simple, actually. The first President Bush put together a very workable coalition in the first Gulf War. And I think that same coalition, absent Japan, unless we could get Japanese to pay for it like they did the first Gulf War, I think would be a good coalition. There are Mideastern states that I think are as much at risk or perhaps more at risk than the United States and other Western states. They have an interest in a coalition. So if asked my opinion, I think the first Gulf War coalition would work pretty well. So thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today, and I look forward to your questions later. Thank you very much.